The Colossus has crumbled. The Tower of Babel is in ruins. Only the winner will now be ascending to the heights of the playoffs. The loser, purgatory in the last chance qualifier. Following that comes a midsummer mystery where the Scandinavians slaughtered the outsiders, only now to be turning on themselves as the inaugural Flashpoint champions take on one of the most legendary names in Counter-Strike history. Of course, it's all going down in the glorious Twickenham Stadium here in London as Flashpoint 2 returns for day 8 of competition. My name is Freya, your host for the duration of the day, and of course joining me up here on this wonderful desk, my analysts Duncan and Alan. Alan, I know you're pumped to be getting in today because we've got some banging games to be kicking off with.
Oh yeah, we certainly do. This repeat matchup of OG Gen.G should be really exciting. Going into the first one, we thought it was going to be very OG-sided. Obviously, it played out. Gen.G won it, so coming into this one, hoping to see better from OG, and hopefully we get a really good game out of this one.
Duncan, I know you're a huge fan of the intros. Can you rate that one for me, please?
That was pretty good. Like, I actually thought thematically you kept it together there. Even the angle of the purgatory one, if people don't know, the idea there is you're sort of between two states. Like, you're not in hell, you're not in heaven, because obviously in the last chance qualifier, you could still come out and not make the playoffs, but you could also be redeemed potentially.
Exactly. And with that, I think we should take a quick recap of our format as well, just in case any of you guys have missed out on any of the action. Of course, there's 3 groups here, all GSL, all best of 3s, all double elimination. Now we are deep into the gauntlet of the groups, which means many of our teams have locked in the spots at the playoffs. But as Duncan mentioned, it means we're also edging closer to the last chance qualifiers. Of course, we've had a few teams over the past couple of days locking their spots in there, and we'll have another one locking it in today. But $1 million on the line here, gentlemen. That's a huge chunk of change to be taken home.
That's obviously the main angle that we have to flex into this tournament, because we're not claiming we have the top 10 ranked teams here and that it's like a major. It certainly isn't, but the prize pool is like a major. And this year, unfortunately, we only had the 2 Flashpoint tournaments and then maybe like Katowice or something in terms of the really big prize money tournaments. So I know if you're a team like Big who rose up during the online era, you're trying to win the big money to show that you are one of the best teams. If you're someone like Fnatic who's had all these problems, you want to get back to the normality of the big pressure game, the big match where like legacy's on the line, essentially.
Yeah, big aspect about this tournament is definitely the format with the double lim playoffs in the best of 3 double lim. You've got to, you've got to be playing some serious Counter-Strike to win this tournament. You've got to, perform series after series. There are going to be teams coming up through the lower bracket, that maybe you wouldn't have expected. But by the time we get to the deep stage of that playoffs, we're hoping to see some really good Counter-Strike.
Well, in case any of you guys at home missed out on the action happening yesterday, we're going to give you a little bit of a recap of exactly what went down. Of course, let's start off with Group A, which saw, of course, Datassette taking on Fnatic. I don't think it's any surprises, gentlemen, that Fnatic came out on top of that one. But Datassette, in that last match, as you can see, 16-14, it did actually end up getting quite close.
I think generally, like, Datassette was a team where the main question was just how would their newer players perform, the ones they brought in, and unfortunately, I think they were kind of a mixed bag. Like, they each had their games where they were good, they each had their games where they were bad. Nobody really looked like they were star quality material, even for this group, and so unfortunately, it was kind of a flat ending, I think, overall for Datassette. Like, even though that last map ended really close, Fnatic was heavily leading on that one. Like, they basically just kind of slowed up right before the finish line for me.
Yeah, coming into this group, though, I think we would have said Datassette were heavy favourites to place last, actually. So even just taking the series off contact,
yes,
it's quite a good result for them. So even from the perspective of trying out these new players, seeing what works or doesn't, they've probably had a pretty decent Flashpoint so far, and hopefully they can build on what they've learned so far with this team.
Yeah, and of course that's exactly how Fnatic found themselves against Mad Lions. It's going to be going on later on today. But of course we also had another group that was going down when we saw MIBR taking on Fours in the Tower, oh, not the Tower of Babel rather, it was actually the Demolition Men. That went down yesterday. A little bit of a surprise there that we were talking about. MIBR actually managing to take it pretty convincingly over Forza.
Yeah, aside from essentially their series against Big, MIBR's new lineup has pretty much exceeded expectations continuously. Like, they very rarely have had, aside from that one series, bad maps overall. They always seem to come up with a little something extra that you don't expect. Actually, the depth of the map pool is pretty ridiculous at this point in time. And then you have players, like, for me, the one that's really shocked me is this guy, Leo Drunky. I knew nothing about this guy, but seems to fit into his role in the team. And actually a pretty well-coached team for a team that it looked like they were doing sort of a cynical PR move by bringing back a legendary guy as their coach.
Yeah, there's a lot of questions, wasn't there, Alan? Just based on, how their form's going to be coming into it. Of course, we'd only seen Blaster as these guys actually taking to the stage beforehand. So maybe a pleasant surprise coming into the tournament.
Well, yeah, it's always the case with a new team that when they play their first tournaments, you have the honeymoon phase, people don't know what they're going to do. There's all these sort of aspects floating around, so you never really know if they're going to be able to replicate that going into future tournaments. I've been pretty pleasantly surprised by MIBR here, and I think they probably are a sleeper team, actually. They could, really hit top 4 here if they come into form as they go into the playoffs.
But of course, we've got to start off by talking about one of our topics of the day. And today, we're going to be chatting about this online era, the sort of COVID era that we've seen happening at the moment in Counter-Strike. Of course, it's been affecting the teams in a lot of ways. Some teams have been capitalizing on it, but some teams have been really heavily affected by it. And I'm wondering, from your guys' opinion, are there any particular teams that we're looking at and going, if this online era hadn't been shifting, they might have had, their breakthrough year as a team?
Yeah, for me, the key aspect is when we say that, like the COVID situation, we don't literally mean people just getting ill from coronavirus. We essentially mean the second and third order effects, which are a lockdown and then everyone going to play online Counter-Strike. So the lockdown has meant, for example, like obviously some teams, like I'm thinking of one of the teams we had in the last tournament, Chaos just lost one of their best players. I mean, he had to go home. He couldn't get the visa anymore. Obviously, it's meant that some of the NA teams that you want to see make big upgrades, they can't necessarily buy a big European player. Then the online aspect, I think there's many teams you can say that's helped and hurt. So for me, some of the classic teams that were in the best form, if you go look at the top 5 before we went online, people like Na'Vi, Fnatic, who's in this tournament, Mouse Sports, these teams almost couldn't miss a playoffs. They were always in contention. But you come online, Fnatic won that first ESL Pro League, and since then, those 3 teams have done almost nothing in terms of championship form. Meanwhile, the teams that have risen up, it's teams outside the top 10 that have not just come in the top 10, they've stormed right up. You've had the teams like Big, who's in this tournament. Actually, you've even seen OG over the years start to get better. Heroic's a ridiculous one because they were number 1 as well. Remember, the amount of teams that have been number 1, it's very unusual for any year that's a LAN play year,
Yeah, it is pretty nuts. I like that you mentioned on Mouse Sports there because our wonderful stats man Yumi, and also Telestrator man Yumi as well, and Caster as well. Man, he's multi-talented. Ray and Yumi over here. He was getting a couple of stats up about this Mouse Sports roster, saying at the end of 2019, their round win percentage was 54%. In 2020, it's dropped to 48.8%. They started the year top 2, and now they've just been gradually descending down the list into June, and that was when they were pushed out of the top 10. So it's been interesting, to be seeing this team shifting.
And they also obviously lost their star player as a result because he was the player hit the hardest by it. That's why Bymas is on the end there. That should be Woxic. Like, this was the guy that everyone was touting as like superstar status. This should have basically been his year to go for a big run near the top of that.
Yeah, his drop-off was quite surprising, really, after the COVID period came in and moving online. Definitely seems like one of those players that only really gets excited for the big lands, the big matches, and he got in the rhythm of that with Hellraisers going into Mouse Sports and coming into this online era. Maybe had motivation problems, maybe, he wasn't as, motivated in practice, all of these sort of things. So going into the server and playing a Mouse Sports, you just saw a gradual decline. And now coming into Cloud9, hopefully we can see Cloud9 in more tournaments and we can see Woxic back to the form we're used to seeing back in those Mouse Sports days.
Yeah, I think another interesting aspect of this as well is looking at how the regions have been divided. We've only really recently seen these North American teams coming over to Europe, and that's been a bit of a baptism by fire themselves. I know, Alan, we were talking about beforehand, Evil Geniuses, appearing at Blast, but really just getting blown out of the tournament because they're not used to playing this certain caliber of competition.
Yeah, EG is definitely the clear example of this whole problem. So what happens is when they play in their own region, they only practice the same teams, they only see the same styles, they kind of get in this kind of microcosm of these different defaults, setups, executes, and all these sort of things. When they come over to Europe and they play the top European teams, the Bigs, the Fnatic, when they're on form, even OG can play pretty well. These sort of teams, they see things they haven't seen for 6 months. They're not in the match fitness of playing against it. The players don't know how to react. It's all so alien to them. So coming into Blast, I did think they were going to perform better, but I'm not totally surprised they came into that. They probably got pretty shocked at what they were seeing in those series. So for all the teams in NA, it's probably been a really tough period from kind of that perspective of getting exposure to top international competition.
I would even say this is why whenever I hear pro players say, like, I want it to be like the LCS, like, let's make these leagues and we'll be like region locked, etc. Well, this is basically what happened in some of those games is the regions that had the best teams in, they just accelerated away to the top level. And if you never got to play them except once, twice a year, you could just never get your grounding. And so a team that in our circuit, obviously, if you had EG like last year traveling all around the world and you had teams like Furia coming up, you start to get blooded into what it's like to play those teams. And crucially, you get adapted to their meta. So there's even a smaller version of this, which is the reason, in my opinion, in this tournament, Forza and VP are kind of like sleepers against all the teams they play. It doesn't matter what their ranking is. If you've never played against that style or with any kind of regularity, it's always going to throw you off. The other teams basically train you to not shut that style down. So if you play against them all the time or they're in the mix, you have to at least think about them going into a tournament, you're going to be in a much better situation, in my opinion. opinion.
Yeah, let's talk about some of the success stories from this era as well, because Duncan, you mentioned it to begin off with. Let's start with big, obviously, at this tournament as well. They began the year in 46th place in the HLTV World Rankings, managed to make it to #1 in the world in summer. Although they've had a little bit of a drop-off in form, we've seen this consistency building, and it's very impressive to see a team make that rise, especially in this period.
Yeah, and the cool thing about big as well is it's not like, for example, a Heroic, where they just only did it in the online period. They actually won that DreamHack Leipzig earlier in the year. Tier 2 top competition, but they were pretty dominant there, actually. There was good teams, I think, off the top of my head, I think maybe even Complexity or someone was at one of those tournaments. And basically, they showed they had some potential. Then they came online. It's not even like they immediately came up the gate. It was about the summer where they started to hit that little run where they won the 2-3 tournaments, and they were beating the best teams that Europe had to offer. Like, they weren't just getting a nice bracket or just one fluky win. They were 2-0-ing people. I mean, famously, FaZe just couldn't buy a win off these guys. On a map like Mirage that everyone else abandoned and said is just a pogging map, they were just money in the bank every time they played this. So, to me, actually, they're a team where I even think if we actually had gone back to LANs like a month ago or something, they might even have been a top contender on LAN.
Yeah, and we drew the comparison, or you drew the comparison rather, with Heroic there. So what kind of differences can we see in terms of how they've been rising through this, Alan?
I think Heroic's a really strange team, actually. From watching them play, so if we look at Big, if we contrast them against Big are a super solid team. They're a super complete team. The way they play on T side is really solid. Tabson's calling's really nice, and they move in and out of the contact plays and into the set executes. They really do have everything on the T side, particularly. Heroic's a bit different, where they come in, gimmicky's the wrong word, but they don't have the same sort of depth, in my opinion, as Big, and they're catching people off guard, particularly in Cologne. I think all throughout of it, they were throwing in weird aggressions, things you wouldn't see normally. Players maybe getting a bit over-aggressive, but it was working because it was online, and they're really feeling it, super confident. So for a Heroic, if it was on LAN, I don't think we'd be seeing the same success. Maybe they'd be, 5th, 6th, 7th team, but in contention for the best in the world, I don't think so. With Big, I totally agree that if it had been, they've probably been cheated actually by this online era, where they could have won 2-3 huge tournaments, 250k sort of tournaments. And I think a lot of people actually are kind of rewriting history with Big, thinking that it was always going to be a success, this team. Keto and Surson, I don't think they were really on anyone's radar coming into the start of this year. They still are pretty inexperienced, to be honest, at the top level, but they've come alive throughout this year. And Surson, he's in contention for being a top 3 AWPer in the world now, and who would have thought that a year ago?
Yeah, I think that's what's so nuts about that story is I remember when we were doing DreamHack Leipzig back then, and it was, the first top LAN that Keto and Sisson had been at with this big clan. And it was really interesting to see, their rise with the team, and it's been incredible to see that coming into it. And I also wanted to pick up on a point that you mentioned earlier, Duncan, when we were discussing this, in terms of the international rosters as well. Of course, we're going to be kicking off with the Tower of Babel, where there are players just literally from every single corner of the globe. So do you feel like there's been an effect in terms of these international rosters having to deal with this online era and maybe not, being in a facility with each other?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for example, I'm fairly sure that another effect, obviously, was some of the big orgs also maybe saw the people who invested into them couldn't give them as much money this year, or said, like, you have to make this budget last. I don't know what I've got for you next year. So I know some of these big teams, some of the Flashpoint teams even, they were in the market to buy big names. And so maybe when, for example, we're looking at maybe FaZe Clan is breaking apart, we have all these different teams, that obviously the Mad Lions players that went to Astralis, some of these players might have been on the radar. Like, they might have been in a Gen G and Envy, one of these sorts of teams, but they just couldn't get the visas. Like, it wasn't even an option to go over at that point in time. So, and then you add in some of the players who trapped overseas. Like, if people don't know, Bentet was in LA for Flashpoint 1 and he just never left, essentially. So this guy never got to go back to his home region. He didn't really play online in the same way the rest of us did. Like, we went back home and played online. This guy was stuck there and he's just had to grin and bear it. Similarly, like, I know they're not in this tournament, but 100 Thieves, they come from Australia. Like, those guys have just been, they normally live in America anyway, but they'd get a break to go back, and the travel in some ways that can provide a little break from the routine. They were just stuck playing those online games from one facility for just months and months at a time with no end in sight. So you could even see how demoralizing that could be essentially to the team itself, regardless of what the level of play is.
Yeah, and I think with that being said, it's time to be heading it to a short break. But when we are back, it's going to be a dish best served cold, as OG are hoping to claim revenge over Gen G after this.
After the break.
Gen G take on another G in what G?
OG
Takes on Gen G.
G. Yeah. Feel that cringe through the camera.